Welcome to Holocaust Museum LA's virtual program, The Beilis Affair, a conversation with Jay Beilis. My name is Michael Morgenstern, and I am the Survivor Programs Associate at the museum, and I'm pleased to welcome you today. Holocaust Museum LA was founded in the early 1960s by a group of Holocaust survivors who wanted to make sure that future generations would always remember and learn from this tragic part of our history. And they did this at a time when most people were not yet ready to learn about the Holocaust. But thanks to their courage and foresight, we have what became the first and oldest Holocaust museum in the United States, always with the mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. Today's program will provide a unique perspective on an important part of Jewish history that took place before the Holocaust. In 1911, Menachem Mendel Beilis, superintendent of a brick factory in the city of Kiev, then a part of the Russian Empire, was arrested and charged with ritual murder, more commonly known as blood libel. Despite no evidence whatsoever that Beilis had anything to do with the murder victim, he endured a brutal 2-year ordeal of imprisonment and torture before his acquittal in 1913. While blood libel charges have frequently appeared throughout Jewish history, today is an opportunity to learn about one case in detail and from a human perspective. When he was arrested, Beilis was taken from his wife Esther and 5 young children. It is truly an honor and privilege to welcome and introduce his grandson, Jay Beilis, a retired businessman whose father, David, was Mendel and Esther's second oldest child. And Jay is joining us from his home in New Jersey, where he will share his grandfather's story with us. Afterwards, we will have an opportunity for questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Jay, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your family's story with our community. It is an honor to have you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you very much for this opportunity. This means a great deal to me and to my family. As one of the esteemed Jewish institutions in the country, this means a great deal. What I'd like to first start with is a little bit of a disclaimer of who I am and who I'm not. My grandfather was Mendel Beilis, as Michael said. My father's father, my name is Beilis. I'm the grandson. So what you're getting is, like Michael said, a unique situation of a family member, even though I never knew my grandfather. He died 20 years before I was born. What I'm not is an academic with a bunch of fancy letters after my name. So if this doesn't come across as polished, please keep the tomatoes and don't throw the tomatoes at the screen. I'll do my best. I think you'll find this interesting. And let's begin. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to begin at the ending. I'm going to read for you now words translated from Hebrew into English, written on my grandfather's gravestone. Now, bear with me. I've read this 200 times and I still get emotional for obvious reasons. So these are the words written on my grandfather's gravestone. He's buried in Queens, New York. Here lies in turn. Pay attention to this grave. Here lies a holy person, a chosen man. The people of the city of Kiev made him a victim, and upon all Israel spread the travail, falsely accused him and his community of taking the blood of a Christian child as demanded by him and his faith for the festival of Passover. They bound him in chains and lowered him into a pit. Many years he did not see the light of day. On behalf of all Israel, he was harshly tortured. Pay a tribute to this pure and guiltless soul, who dwells in the shadow of the Lord in the heights of heaven, until those who slumber shall awaken to life. Menachem Mendel, son of Tuya, died the 24th of Tammuz, 5694. May his memory be an eternal blessing. May his soul be bound in the bond of life eternal. Those are the words written on my grandfather's gravestone. 2 weeks after my grandfather was acquitted, none other than the most famous Yiddish writer of all time, Sholem Aleichem, went to his house and told him the weight of 12 million Jews were on his shoulders for every day he was in prison. And we know what happened to half of them. I'll give more detail at the end what this means and means to my family. But as I said, just like Jews left Europe after Kristallnacht, left Germany and Austria after Kristallnacht, Jews left all over Europe after my grandfather's trial, which is something that I'm very, very proud of. Again, appreciate the opportunity. Now, when I give these lectures in live, I point out that everyone is sitting in chairs. I'm sitting in the chair, you're sitting in the chair. Now, the reason why you can sit in the chair is you have four legs that support the chair. The four legs that support this ugly term of anti-Semitism are such. One, the accusation that Jews killed Christ. Two is something called dual loyalties, where Jews are accused of having loyalties to outside interests. The last president told a group of Jewish businessmen that Bibi was their prime minister. That's accusing Jews of dual loyalty. The third leg is something called the Elders of the Protocols of Zion, which was a forged document from 120 years ago that accused Jews of worldwide conspiracies, running the banks. At the time, you had the Rothschild family, several brothers in different countries, but that had to do with the whole example of a worldwide conspiracy, again, of Jews running the world, controlling power. Now, of course, today, it's been brought up to Jews control Hollywood, Jews control this, Jews control that. It's something that we've all been all familiar with. The fourth leg is something called libels. Now, libels are as obvious. The definition of the word is a false accusation. So now that's also broken down too. So all blood libels are libels, but not all libels are blood libels. The other examples of libels were just during the 1500s of Middle centuries. Jews were accused of causing the plagues, the Black Plagues, poisoning wells. But as far as the blood libel, for 875 years, since 1144, the blood libel had only one definition, and that Jews were accused around the holidays. It's known as the Passover story, but it happened other holidays too, like Purim and even New Year's and Yom Kippur. That blood was needed for fanatical ritual purposes. Wouldn't be necessarily a Jew like you and me, but Hasads, very religious, a secret sect, secret code words, and they would need blood for ritual purposes, and that's the only definition that blood libel means. In the last 10 years or so ago, the people have inserted the word modern in front of blood libel, and all of a sudden, almost anything that can occur could be caused of blood libel. The blood libel could be mentioned 100 or 200 times a day on Twitter. I know I see it, and maybe 5 times it's accurate. Otherwise, it's used for for the people use the point to sensationalize their point. And it's really not fair to the roughly 150 cases of blood libel that first started in 1144 in England and ended with my grandfather's in 1930 in Russia. Politicians use it. Netanyahu used it because his feelings were hurt several years ago. A couple of years ago, an Arab child fell down a well in Israel, and they called it a blood libel. It's a libel because it was a false accusation. We didn't do that. The Jews didn't do that, but they still called it a blood libel. But that's not what blood libel means. Again, blood libel means that the blood is needed for ritual purposes, and that's what it means. Not really anything. Not really anything else. Again, as I said, there was roughly the first one. Well, there were blood libels in ancient times, but basically, not that you can call it modern times. The first one was recognized in 1144 in Norwich, England, where a boy went missing, and there were basically 5 major ones of the 150. There was that one. Then 100 years later, there was Little Lincoln, also in Lincoln, in England. In 1475. There was the Simon of Trent, which is the one that the QAnon people latch onto with the adrenochrome and the blood and Pizzagate. They use the Simon and Trent. I'm glad they don't use my family. I don't need it, but they use that 1475 case as part of the blood libel accusations that they get involved with. And then in 1840 was the Damascus, Syria one, which obviously the folks in the Arab world use as an example of blood libel. And then the last one, again, was my grandfather's, like Michael said, from 1913 to 1911 to 1913. There was a blood libel accusation in post-war Poland, as if the Polish Jews didn't suffer enough, where dozens of Jews were murdered in the town of Kalisz. But it wasn't, somebody wasn't arrested, there was no trial or anything. My grandfather's was one of the very few where somebody was actually picked out and actually accused, arrested, put on trial, jailed, as Michael said. His trial was 6 weeks long. Now, again, no, a blood libel is not. No one wakes up in the morning and say, "Okay, let's create a blood libel." It's a crime of opportunity. A child would go missing, usually a boy, usually in 10 years old, 8 years old, 12 years old, 10 years old or so. A boy would go missing, and now that would start the blood libel accusation from people who are just bad people. They would seize on the opportunity, and that's what happened in my grandfather's case. So again, it's usually a boy, and again, it's not something that is planned. It's a crime of opportunity. So now we're going to talk. That's the one segment, just to give the background of a blood libel so people understand, because they hear it in the news, but they really need to have it accurately described, because again, for 860 years or so, it had one definition. And now for the last 10 years, people have used it for their own ways to sensationalize their old points, which again, is really not fair to my family and to the other 150 victims. There were some horrible ones in the Middle Ages where rabbis made a deal with the town. They would go to the local cardinal, and by the time they got back, whole villages were burned at the stake. Don't ask for details. I don't know the deep, but I know roughly that things like that happen. So now we fast forward to what happened with my grandfather. On the morning of March 11th, 1911, two boys, Andrei Yashensky and Zedny Shevninov, decided on a Saturday, decided to skip school and go to the outskirts of Kiev. On the outskirts of Kiev, there was a series of caves, and this folklore, urban legend, call it what you want, going back to the 1700s, where the princes and other well-known people hid their jewels and their diamonds in these caves. Now, if you could imagine how that would interest people like us, imagine how it would send the minds of young boys or girls, as it were, but it's usually boys, wild about, like, let's go look at those caves. So on that morning, the two boys, Andre was about 12, but he was very diminutive, and he wasn't all there as far as more like a 9 or 10-year-old as far as what he had going on upstairs. Zedny was much more of like the brains of the operation, and he decided to go look out of these caves. Zedny picked up a stick, and almost like they use what they call divining rods, where you're going to find water and you run the stick along the ground, and that's going to find you water. So Zedny decided he was going to do that, and after a while, well, of course, fruitless. I mean, he wasn't going to find jewels using a stick like that. Andre said, "Okay, now it's my turn." And Zedny says, "Well, no, go get your own stick." And Andre said, "No." He says, "You have the magic stick." Again, Andre was not the sharpest tool in the shed. He said, "No, I want to use the stick." And Zedny said, "No." And Andre said, "Well, if you don't let me use your magic stick, I'm going to tell the police what your mom does." And with that one simple statement, that sealed his fate. Zedny Shevardik's mother, whose name is Vera, was well known in the community as a criminal. She ran a criminal gang, mostly fencing. They weren't murderers, but they ran a fencing operation where they were fencing various goods. So Zedny came home. He told Mom, Vera, and Vera said, "Well, something has to be done to Andre." Andre was lured into the house and murdered by her 2 or 3 accomplices. During the trial, it came out the neighbors had heard a boy screaming, and then all of a sudden it went quiet, and they saw these 2 other gentlemen, if you can call them gentlemen, leave the house, and that. While it was never really totally proven that it was Vera who did it and ordered the murder, she had what they call motive, and that's what actually got the whole story going. So this was on March 11th. The boy was found a couple of days later, and at the funeral on March 20th, a young 19-year-old by the name of Guvilov, a reactionary, not revolutionary. This is 6-7 years before the revolution. He's a reactionary, pro-czar, began handing out leaflets at the funeral. Christians, beware. This time of the year, the Jews steal your children and murder them because they need their blood for Passover. He was handing out leaflets. And, you know, it may not have really gone that much far. You look at the kid, he's 19 years old, he's crazy, you know, well, let's not pay attention. But the problem is, he was a member of what their version of the Klan was, which is called the Black Hundreds. It was like, again, their version of the Ku Klux Klan. And they had their own publications, and it started to gain traction. And it started to gain traction. And before you knew it, it ended up in the Tsar's lap, who at the time was in St. Petersburg. At the same time, naturally, the Kiev prosecutors and law enforcement assigned a detective, Kursazov, who was basically known as the Russian Sherlock Holmes, a man with a 20-year career record. And within a couple of weeks, he automatically figured out that it was Vera who ordered the murder, or was accomplice in the murder. But that didn't matter. It ended up costing him his job. They jailed him on false accusations while the case started again to gain traction, and it fell into the Tsar's lap. And the Tsar, who started to see that, like, you know, the Jews were starting to get a little bit too much power after the 1905 revolution. I'm going to use this blood libel to put the Jews back in their place. So he endorsed it, and he fully supported it. To the point, as I said, they fired the detective, and as time goes on into the spring of April and then into May, it became clearer and clearer, because this Sherlock Holmes detective, as it were, began doing his own research and was able to provide even more evidence that Vera was behind this murder, because what she had was motive. My grandfather had no motive. She had motive, because she needed to eliminate poor Andre again. So when they found his body in the cave, he had 47 stab wounds all over his body. And they found him. They were only able to identify him because they found him in an upright position with his knapsack and his school books. So they were able to identify him. You know, you didn't have forensics like you have today. So they were able to identify them just by this rucksack with the books that he had in. Initially, the suspicion was that it might have been Andre's parents, because Andre's father had died during the Russian war and was left money, and it was only allowed to they were allowed to collect the money because it was in Andre's name if he was gone. So they initially thought Andre's mother might have been actually the murderer, but of course that's not what happened. The mother had nothing to do with it. So in the spring of 1911, the months dragged by until July. Again, now I give you dates because history, as you all know, has to do with dates. History, you have the two calendars. You got the Russian calendar, and the dates don't always drive. But to give a good date of July 22nd, at very early in the morning, 5 o'clock or so in the morning, the Cossacks, as it were, 12 of them, began banging on my grandfather's door and arrested him. They wouldn't tell him what it was. There were 5 children, all under 10, including my father. My father was 8 at the time. Began wailing, grabbing my father's leg. What is this all about? They wouldn't tell him. They just told him that my grandfather needed to go with them. Again, 5 o'clock in the morning, and that he would be placed under arrest. And now in the American system, in our Bill of Rights, when you're arrested, you have to be indicted within 48 hours, or you need to be released. No such law existed in Russia. He was arrested in July 22nd, 19, and he wasn't indicted till the following February. So he was in jail for almost 8 months, not indicted. And what the important part of that was, he wasn't allowed to see his lawyers, because he wasn't formally indicted. He had a couple of visits from his wife and a visit from his brother Aaron, but he wasn't allowed to consult with his lawyers until he was formally indicted in February of 1912, which really is pretty amazing when you think about it, when you compare it to American protocol, American standards. So that was again February 1912, and he was in prison, and it wasn't an easy time. There were stories of they had to eat out of a common pot, and somebody found a mouse, and the fellow prisoners were fighting over who would eat the mouse. And he had stories in the book. He wrote his memoir where they had 13 locks on his door, and 5 times a day they would undo the locks and slam it closed. And of course, there was no heating and no air conditioning, so he basically, almost froze to death a whole bunch of times, to the point at one point he had really bad sores on his feet because he had no shoes, and they brought him to the doctor. I don't know if it's the equivalent of podiatrist, but it was a doctor, and the doctor took a knife out and started digging into the calluses and the sores on his foot. And then he said, "Well, now you know how young Andre felt when you drained him and murdered him." So much for the Hippocratic Oath, but this is what this deranged doctor did to my grandfather. But a certain segment felt that he was guilty of the charge. Now it went on into the incarceration went on into the summer, and now in the summer of 1912, there was a great stir around because it was the 300th anniversary of the Romanov Empire, and word started to get around that they were going to let out of the prisons all the Politniks or the Fuseniks or their equivalent, and they were going to empty out the prisons. And word got to my grandfather that he would soon be free, and he said no. He says, "You could shoot me." He says, "But I'm not leaving the prison until I get a fair trial." He says, "Because if I don't, there'll always be the shadow of, was he innocent? Was he guilty?" And at that point, he realized what Sholem Aleichem had told him 15 months later, that the weight of all of these Jews were on his shoulders. And he felt that if he had taken this freebie to get out of prison, it would still leave a shadow of a doubt of maybe he did it, maybe there was a blood libel. So he insisted on staying in prison for another 15 months, again, under a very, 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 very difficult conditions, before he was actually given a trial. Now, the trial began on September 25th of 1913 and lasted 6 weeks. So now, what is the prosecution? Now, if you ever watched any of those Law and Order type shows, what does the prosecution need to prove its case? You need a body, you need a weapon, you need a motive, you need witnesses. Now, the witnesses are both eyewitnesses to the crime and witnesses to the nature of the murder. Now, the nature of this murder was twofold. One was the brutality of the child being murdered. So they brought in a forensic doctor who was actually a psychiatrist, one of the virulently anti-Semites by the name of Sikorsky. Ivan Sikorsky was brought in. That name may or may not sound familiar. His son was Igor Sikorsky, who is known as the father of the modern helicopter in the 20s and 30s. And the younger one, the son, best friend, was Lindbergh. So we know the apple didn't fall far from the tree. I mean, Sikorsky is still a helicopter producing company. I think they're in Connecticut. But again, the son was best friends with Lindbergh, and we know what type of person Lindbergh was. So the father was just as bad as an anti-Semite. So so you have that, and then what you would need, since this is a ritual murder trial, you would need an expert on the Talmud, both sides. You'd have the prosecution would need their expert, and the defense would need their expert to refute whatever the prosecution decided to come up with. And basically, the prosecution's case fell apart from the beginning. Naturally, of course, they had the body, the weapon. Now, you would think for a weapon, you would want to have a sharp blade at night if you wanted to drain all that blood out, but it was something more of like a bludgeoning type item, although of course the blood was drained out of his body because they found him several days later. But if you were going to create a wounds to get blood out, to extract out for your motives, you wouldn't use a blunt object. That would be more like a hammer to beat somebody to death. But okay, I made my point. I know that's not really all that colorful. And then, of course, you needed a motive. Now, the motive was because Vera killed his child. My grandfather had nothing to do with this. So now the eyewitness, the principal initial, the defense called 135 witnesses, the prosecution called 35. Most of the ones that my grandfather called, they were basically, since my grandfather was a manager in a brick factory, the co-workers. He worked on Shabbos, which is a little bit ironic, because he was religious, but not a religious man, enough that, and that came out, of course, during the trial to a great degree, because they wanted to prove that, he was part of this sect with Schneerson and, this really strict Hasidim, and he just said, look, I can pray at home, I can daven at home. He says, I'm work on Saturdays, this is my responsibility. And they had many co-workers. He was known very fondly as our little Mendel, and that testified that they saw him, with the bill of ladings. At that particular day, they had a shipment of 10,000 bricks. So the factory was quite busy as far as like him being at his desk, doing his work. The prosecution tried to work it out that, maybe he slipped out for a couple of hours and killed the child and did all of this, but there was nothing that they could prove any of that, because none of that really happened. The chief eyewitness initially was a couple. Their name was Shertasky, but they were known by their occupation, which was called lamplighters. Of course, before electric street lights, their job was to use giant sticks and to go down the street in the evening and light the oil lamps with oil. That was their occupation, and they were known as the lamplighters. They told the police when it first happened, they saw a man with a black robe, with a black beard, with a black hat. You know where I'm going with that. Leave the factory with, like you see in the mobster movies, when they wrap a body in a carpet. They didn't testify. They went to the police and they saw, again, a man with the black robe, with the black hat, leave with that quote unquote carpet and going off to the caves. That was their primary eyewitness. And that's a very important eyewitness to have. The only problem is when they put somebody on the stand and you're supposed to tell the truth, they recanted everything. First, the husband went on and he said, look, they gave us vodka. They told us what to say. We were drunk. We didn't see anything. We don't know anything. Like in Hogan's Heroes, I know nothing. We knew nothing. We know nothing. Then they put the wife on and she said the same thing. And hers was almost quasi hysterical, because she kept saying, you need to leave me alone. I didn't see anything. I don't know anything. I just want to go home, to the point that the courtroom began laughing, and I think my grandfather actually kind of smiled once or twice too. And that really brought down the case from that point, because they lost their eyewitness. In fact, as I said, the trial lasted for 6 weeks, and for the last 4 weeks of the trial, my grandfather's name was barely ever mentioned, even though he was sitting in the docket, because their case was to prove that a ritual murder had occurred. So what they did was they came up with two indictments: one, that a blood libel had occurred; second, that my grandfather was guilty of the blood libel. So that was the eyewitness for that. Now the next witness, let me see. Yeah, I have to read the next part. Okay, so now the next people that came were those experts. Again, there was Sikorsky, who was the medical expert for the prosecution, although he got it wrong, because he said that the number 13 was important in these Jewish rituals, and it turned out there were 14 wounds around the head, 47 on the body, but there were 14 around the head, which proved that he didn't know what he was talking about, because according to him, it's Jewish law, it was 13 wounds was part of this, fanatical religious point. So he was the medical examiner. Now, in order to prove the religious end, they couldn't find anybody, because the whole case was so preposterous that they couldn't really find anybody to go along to say, hey, look, Jews do this. In fact, it was the exact opposite. They had Greek Orthodox priests come in and say, look, these things don't happen. The Jews don't do things like this. And this is also part of the witnesses that they had called. They called in these people that were saying, hey, look, they had a couple of people that say, hey, look, I was adopted by a Jewish family. I know all of their customs. I know for a fact that, if a little bit of blood goes near an egg, they have to throw the egg away. And they testified to all of these different things. And again, as I said, the case fell apart completely. So they finally found this the frocked priest from Lithuania by the name of Priantius. 20 years early, he wrote a book called The Talmud Unmasked, so he was, according to them, the only expert they could find that would say, Jews do these kinds of things. So my grandfather had 5 lawyers. One was Jewish. His name was Grusenberg. There's a main street in Tel Aviv named after Grusenberg. The other 4 lawyers were not Jewish. So whenever I give this lecture, I try to point out that this is not an anti-Christian story, that he was defended by the four lawyers who were Christians. All the co-workers who called him our little Mendel testified that he was not, that he was basically a good man. And in his memoir, he also thanked everybody and thanked the detective Sherlock Holmes, as it were, because it cost him his career. And he was always grateful, several pages in the book, grateful about how he put his whole life and career on the line to save my grandfather. So they were able, what the defense attorneys were able to do was able to trick this Priantis, who was basically an idiot. So I'm just going to read this passage. So one of his lawyers by the name of Ziadnik, who I actually met his great niece, which was one of those small world things. So anyway, it says here, Priantis presented a long statement with imaginary proofs from the Talmud and other books that Jews require blood for Passover, but he is a bore and an ignoramus. He was asked when Mrs. Baba Bathra lived and didn't know the answer. But 2 of the Christian professors testified that no such woman, Baba Bathra, ever lived. He was tricked. The plain tense of the word means last gate, and in the Talmud, there's a tractate devoted to a specific set of laws that is divided into 3 volumes, the last being Baba Bathra. So it's part of the Talmud, but there's no person by the name of Baba Bathra, the last gate. And basically it says here, anyone who doesn't know the meaning of these words, which every Jewish child should know, and insists on citing them as document, is despite his ignorance, is a fraud. And at that time, and even my grandfather began laughing because my grandfather began laughing because they all saw how hysterical this was, that supposedly this man is an authority on the Talmud, and he knew absolutely nothing. He was the expert for the prosecution. The expert for my grandfather was Rabbi Maza, who was the chief rabbi in Russia / Moscow. And Rabbi Maza spoke eloquently in Russian for hours about Jews don't do this. Now, a little bit of irony in it, not to name drop, but it's interesting, is that you would not know the name Maza, Rabbi Maza, but his nephew was none other than the famous comedian Jackie Mason. If you remember, if you people my age remember Jackie Mason, Ed Sullivan Show, but that was his uncle. And I had that verified with his niece on Twitter. So, and unfortunately, I wasn't able to get to Jackie before he passed away to say, hey, look at me, isn't this interesting? But it was Jackie Mason's uncle who was the rabbi that spoke eloquently for many hours about the Jews don't do these kinds of things. I mean, he was, quote unquote, expert in the field. So now it again a 6-week trial, and it drew towards the end. The jury was made up of 12. 6 were members of that Black Hundred, so we all knew how they were going to vote, and 6 were basic common peasants in peasants. There was no intelligentsia, there were no academics on the jury, there was no intelligentsia as the word goes. 6 peasants and 6 members of the Black Hundreds. So you kind of knew where it was going. Now, unlike in America, as we know, there's several trials in the news now, the jury is sent to the jury room and you have to vote 12-0. They'll keep you in the jury room until all 12 people vote one way or the other. If not, after a certain amount of time, a mistrial will be declared, and then it's up to the prosecution to decide if they want to try the person again. Russia, it's different. In fact, actually, in some ways, a lot more liberal. If you had a verdict of 6-6, the person was allowed to go free. So, at the end of the 6 weeks, the what happened was that the judge by the name of Bolderov, another virulently anti-Semite who just made rulings after rulings after rulings while the court was going on, totally in the prosecution's favor, gave a charge. That's the instructions to the jury. And his charge to the jury was, you've heard evidence for 6 weeks. Only thing you need to consider is that a Christian child has been murdered and a Jew has been accused of this murder. That's the only thing you should consider. Interesting. Talk about having something getting thrown out on appeal. 170 people, well, 135 from my side, testified. The lamplighter's testimony fell apart. Prenantius knew nothing, but that was the charge that the judge gave to the jury. So the jury deliberated for only a short time and came back, and as I said earlier, there were two verdicts. Two accusations. One, that a ritual murder had occurred, and secondly, that my grandfather was guilty of this murder. The verdict came back. It was read. Jury, have you determined that a blood libel has occurred in this situation, in this case? Yes. The vote was 7-5. Obviously, the 6 black hundreds, they were going to vote. They would vote that the sky is purple. They were going to vote. They were voting against my grandfather. He was a Jew. There's no way he wasn't. It would be like 6 members of the Klan sitting there and voting. And then what happened was among the peasants, one of the peasants voted guilty. So the guilty was 7-5 that a blood libel had occurred. Now, could you imagine what went through my grandfather's mind in the 30 seconds before they read the second verdict, which would be, did my grandfather commit the murder? I can only imagine what went through my grandfather's mind. He had to have thought, and he wrote it in his book because he was able to look at the jury, that he was most certainly going to be found guilty. They polled the jury. The one who was in the 7th, stood up, crossed himself, and said, I'm a man of Christian, and I owe my life to God, and I cannot find this man guilty. So he voted 6-6, and under Russian law, my grandfather was acquitted of the murder of Andrei Yashinsky. So it was actually the bad people, as it were, to say that, really had their own victory. To this day, I mean, I get emails or whatever, or texts, and not so much texts, emails, are you sure your grandfather didn't do this, And they're looking for little tidbits, like maybe I misstep or something, and now they put it in their publication. Hey, look, the grandson of Mendel Beilis can't be sure his grandfather's innocent. So, of course, at this point, it started 20 years ago for the very anti-Semitic area in Australia, and I wised up to realize what they were doing. So I don't even respond to people like that anymore. But that's what they're looking for. They're looking for any little thing that now they could put in their papers. Hey, the grandson isn't sure. Maybe he did commit these murders. But anyway, the jury heard all the evidence, all the one-way evidence, as it were. And then, so he was found innocent. And the judge said to him, Bolderev said to him, he says, well, you may not like what I'm about to say, but I think it's for your own benefit. And the benefit is for you to spend one more night in jail. I think if I release you now, you won't be safe on the streets. And my grandfather pondered that and said, I think you're right. And he went and spent one more night in jail. And at that time, after that, he went home to his loving family and his wife and his kids. It became an instant celebrity. People from all over, non-Jews too, because it was a non-Jewish area, came to his house. In fact, the traffic was so busy that the train took down the sign outside of his house, or in close proximity of his house, and put up a sign saying Beilis Station. So people would know where to get off to see my grandfather, and they came by the thousands. As I said before, my Aunt Rachel lived to 102, so she only died 15 years ago, 12 years ago or so. And she would tell me stories about that, how she said enough already. And not only that, but the commander, I don't remember if it was a colonel or a captain, said that he was able to retire early from taking all the bribes from people cutting in the lines to going to see my grandfather. And it was at that point, 2 weeks after, like I said before, the Sholem Aleichem was one of his visitors and told him what I said at the beginning of this hour, that the weight of 12 million Jews were on his shoulders for every day he was in prison. And again, we know what happened to half of them. And at that point, so I mean, obviously, so now this is the end of October. He couldn't go back to his job. He, didn't know what kind of a living he has. It was always out there again that a blood libel did occur. Will the Black Hundreds come and kill him and kill his whole family? So obviously he couldn't stay in Ukraine there was no Ukraine at the time until 10 years later. So, I mean, it's always listed as a Russian story, even though it's in Kiev. But the Ukrainians can't get mad because technically there was no Ukraine until 10 years later. So there's a little dysfunction there. But, it was in Kiev, which was known, as Michael said, part of the Russian Empire. So soon after that, the family left. Obviously, they didn't jump on the Concorde. They went mostly by train through all of these different countries. And when they got to the northern city of Italy, known as Trieste, there was roughly 20,000 people waiting for him. That's how much of a celebrity, 1,000 miles away in Italy. And then they made him. My father used to say he saw more of Italy than 99% of any Italian that ever lived, because they went through the whole country of Italy, all the way down to the boot, ended up in Cyprus, and then ended up in Haifa. Because he wanted to go as what he called the land of Israel. That was his dream, and he was made all sorts of promises, including all sorts of promises. Going to get houses for him and set him up and get him. All he wanted really was a farm. He wanted to have a farm so he could just return to some sort of normalcy. And the Rothschilds made him all sorts of offers which never amounted to anything, and times were very harsh. It was the time of the Ottoman Empire when the Turks were ruling that area. Of course, there was a large amount of Arabs. There was a certain amount of Jews that lived in the area, but it was ruled by the Ottoman Empire. And then the First World War started, and it wasn't so easy. And my father's older brother joined the army. In fact, he was the very, very first member of the Jewish Legion. And he died when he was 19 over circumstances that I'm not really going to get into. And that really got to the point that my grandfather decided really wasn't much of a point to go to continue to live in what he called, again, I'm not going to use the P word, he called it the land of Israel. So he, as most families and most of your families, he came first to America, and then after the death of my uncle, he sent for the rest of the family, and the family came here and ended up in the Bronx, New York, where we lived and where I was born, and we all lived. And in 1926, he wrote his autobiography in Yiddish, which was translated by one of his initial lawyers, who wasn't part of the case because he was called as a witness. So, of course, a witness can't be his lawyer, by name of Arnold Mongolian. He's the one who transferred the book. This is the book right now. It's hard to get it in focus. Okay, I don't know why that doesn't happen. As you can see, it's a blue book. I don't know why. It doesn't seem to. Anyway, if you're really interested in the case, you can. I mean, I'm not a book peddler. I mean, last year my royalties on this book was $43. So I'm not a book peddler. I'm not a schnorrer. But I mean, if people want to know more about the case, you can knock the book off in a couple of hours. Now, my grandfather wrote the book in 1926. It was translated into English. So now, of course, it's long out of the public domain, and other people have copied the book. Not to the extent of this, because we have additional chapters in here. So, I mean, and people are making money off of the book. Again, my royalties was $43. I just mean if people were interested in the story, to go on to Amazon. It's basically free on Kindle. If you want to buy the actual book, it's probably 10, 12 bucks. But remember, it's the blue book. I don't know why. Oh, wait, maybe it's coming out a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, it's not coming out that much better. But anyway, you see, it's got the blue label, and that's his autobiography translated into English, and we redid it into. We went through the old Yiddish just to make sure it all was kosher as it were. And he got various jobs in America, but it was very, very tough. I mean, the 30 months in prison took a lot out of his life, and he died. And then at the time, it was known to go up to what they call Saratoga Springs up in New York, again, Health Springs, where he died in 1934. His services were at the Eldridge Street Synagogue in Lower Manhattan. 4,000 people showed up. They had to bring in extra police. 20 years after the trial, 4,000 people showed up for his services after the funeral. So that basically is the overview of the whole case. And now what I just spend a couple of last minutes, basically, what does it really mean to be the grandson? And as I said before, just like Jews left Austria and Germany and Kristallnacht, Jews left all over Europe. When 60 years ago, when I was about 10, the family used to spend the summers over in the bungalow colonies in what they called the Bosch Belt. Again, this was 50 years after the trial, and when word got around that my father was there, long after my grandfather was there, my father was there, people would come from all over, and word got around fast that my father was there, and it was pretty emotional for a 10-year-old to see people who were in their 60s and 70s get on their knees and really cry and tell my father what it meant, what the trial meant to them, how their family left all sorts of countries. In fact, they used to bring sweets, and at the time my mother had just been diagnosed with diabetes, and she would say, "Why are they bringing sweets and sugar? I can't eat this, you know. This is not what what we need, you know." But anyway, they brought it because as a gesture. This was 1963. Fast forward to 1984, a movie by Carl Lanzmann came out called Shoah. It was an 8-hour movie about the Holocaust. I was about 30 at the time, and I went to see the movie on Broadway in Manhattan. And I was 30, and I was easily the youngest person there by 50 years. So there were people there. Then again, this was 70 years now after the trial. So there are people there that were, if they were 85, they were teenagers at the time of the trial. And this little lady came over to me and she goes, "Oh, this is really interesting. This is really good that young people are interested in the show." We're talking the mid 80s, 40 years ago. There wasn't that much interest in the show. In fact, a couple of movies that were made that were really awful about the show. And she said, and she said, "Did you lose anybody in the Holocaust?" And I said, "Well, nobody really close, so maybe on my mother's side." I said, and I told her briefly who my grandfather was, and she says, "Well, I don't really know the story, but one of my best friends is coming, and he may know." And the man came over, and when I told him, the man gave me like a hug. I thought he was going to break my back. He says, "I can't believe that's you." So now I went into the theater with my two new best friends, and if you remember the movie Show, it was an 8-hour movie, and there was intermission halfway through. And again, I sat with my friends, and I hear all of this whispers all around me, and at the break, at the intermission, they turned the lights on, and I have like 60 sets of eyes looking right at me, because people were nudging each other. "Hey, you know who that is?" And again, I'm not my grandfather. I never pretended to be my grandfather, but people would come up during intermission and would tell me those same stories. And then lastly, I was invited for, again, the Eldridge Street Synagogue. It was the 125th anniversary 20-something years ago. And I gave a little bit of this speech, not the whole thing. I spoke for 10, 15 minutes on the highlights of the case. And a well-known academic, a guy who's published, he says, "That's all nonsense. That's all family lore. That never happened. Nobody ever left Europe." And I remember a young girl, teenager, 16, 18, she goes, "Sir, I don't know what you're talking about." She says, "But my grandmother told me they left Lithuania after the trial." And other people got up too and basically, quote unquote, shot the man down to say that, like, "You don't know what you're talking about. People left all over." So, I mean, it really made a difference as far as, as far as the trial. And in some ways, there's a lot of irony in that, because my grandfather had a good job. The kids were in school. The oldest one who had died was in what they call the gymnasium. The younger children, Rachel wasn't old enough. They were in schools, so he really had no reason to leave that area, which means that they would have ended up in Babi Yar, in the Babi Yar pits. So and there's like a little irony in there that if it didn't happen, if this accusation didn't occur, none of this would have happened. And then, of course, again, not to go back, but then the Bolsheviks came in and basically murdered everybody involved with the trial. Boldarev was murdered. The prosecutors were murdered. Vera was murdered. Everybody responsible with the case was murdered. There's a chapter in one of Trotsky's books. I mean, we're virulently anti-communist, but there's a chapter in one of Trotsky's books that said that my grandfather's trial had the greatest impact on Lenin as far as the plight of the Jews. So although it's a story that's not known now, the Hasidim know it. They love me because they know, they understand it, because they get what the whole point is, that about a ritual murder and the Jews being accused of these heinous crimes. But the story is, again, not very well known. I mean, my dream is to get a movie made. So if anybody has Spielberg's number, contact me on Twitter or leave a message here in chat, and because Hollywood always loved a courtroom scene, and they would make a tremendous movie, although nobody would believe it. I mean, who would believe Bolderov telling the jury not to listen to any of it? But truth is stranger than fiction, and that's what really would happen. So really, that's all really what I have to say today. I mean, I hope folks enjoyed it. I mean, we're open for Q&A. So yeah, that's 50 minutes. I spoke for 50 minutes. That's pretty much usually 45, 50 minutes to tell the story. I hope, if people have questions, I'm here to entertain the questions, and I hope you enjoyed it. And you need to, if anybody wants to find me, I'm always on Twitter, probably more often than I need to be. But you can find me on Twitter if you have anything to say, or if you have any ideas or anything you want to communicate. So Michael, would you please come in now? And
thank you so much for sharing your story with us.
How was it? Okay.
Today. Well, thank you. Wonderful. Thank you very much.
No, I could talk fast sometimes with my Bronx accent, but anyway, sir, go ahead.
Not a problem. Thank you so much. We have people commenting and saying thank you so much for sharing. If anybody has questions, you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. One question we have, did you talk with your father about this at all, about his father, and what was it like to hear about this from him or from your father's siblings?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's yeah. I mean, my father was 50 when I was born, so I was a teenager when he was already 65, and he died suddenly when he was 75. Boy, would I have loved to interview him. He the stories he could have told. So he didn't really want to talk about it all that much. A lot of Holocaust survivors, they don't want to talk about their experience. So he didn't really want to talk a whole lot about it. The only one really was my Aunt Rachel, again, who lived to 102, that died 10, 15 years ago. But even she, I mean, she was like 3 or 4 at the time of the trial. So she didn't really have a whole lot unfortunately, have a whole lot to say about the trial. It really is unfortunate. I would have loved to have, especially a professional interview, especially interview my father. A documentary filmmaker by the name of Albert Maysels wanted to make a film about my grandfather. In fact, he found my aunt first and recorded many, many, many hours of interviews with my aunt. He since died, and the studio won't even let me see the tapes. I mean, I don't know if she ever signed any release or anything like that, but they own the tapes and they won't even let me see them. And these are interviews with her about the trial and about the trial, about her existence, and about her being the granddaughter. I mean, her being the actual daughter of Mendel Beilis. So there really isn't a lot. I'm thankful that 10 years ago, a man by the name of Ed Levin wrote a definitive book on the story of the case. He went to Kiev for the very first time, went through all the newspapers, read all in Russian, again, Russian, not Ukrainian, read all the Russian papers, and wrote, again, the definitive book on my grandfather's case, which is like, basically the encyclopedia of the book. But let me see,
Thank you so much. So we did have a question about The Fixer. If you'd be willing to speak a little bit about your perspective on that book.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I was reading these questions. What was the question? I'm sorry.
The question was, we did get one about The Fixer and about your perspective on that book.
Okay, so again, my grandfather wrote his book in Yiddish in 1926, and the copyright laws basically, I don't know the exact amount, but I think you have 17 years and you're allowed to have one automatic renewal, and then after that, the book comes out in public domain. Well, a couple of years after the book was out in public domain, a very famous writer by the name of Bernard Malamud, who wrote he's known as one of the great Jewish writers ever, or definitely in the last 50 years, came out with a book called The Fixer. In the book, The Fixer, I mean, I was like 14 when the book came out. I wasn't allowed to read it, and it was really bad news because he stole whole passages. In fact, in the blue book that I showed you before, at the end, we have a chapter where we give three dozen examples of what Malamud did. Like I said before, there was one story where he had like 15 locks on his cell, and 6 times a day they'd come in, undo the lock. So Malamud changed it to The Fixer to 11 locks. Then I said to you before, there was a story about a half a mouse be found in a pot where the common criminals would eat it. So a quarter of a mouse, he changed it to a half a mouse. I mean, he wrote a letter to my father saying, has nothing to do with it, and he really defamed my grandfather. He made it, he wrote a book of fiction. He wrote that my grandmother was running around with other men when my grandfather was in prison, and I was 14, and I was trying to explain to my father, this is fiction. He can basically do whatever he wants, and my father, it was almost like he was going to throw me against the wall. He was like, go play with your friends. You don't realize what he did to what he did to my father. And he won the Pulitzer Prize, and he won the book review by copying my grandfather's book, by copying out basically whole passages out of the book. I mean, he's long dead now. I mean, he had no relationship with his daughter. I know he wrote some great books. Look, The Natural was supposedly one of the finest books in a Robert Redford movie and all of that. As I said, he's one of the well-known writers of the last 50 years. I'm not saying people shouldn't read his books, but this was pure plagiarism. And it came out again like a year or two after the copyrights expired on my grandfather's book. We spoke to a lawyer, but the guy wanted like $4,000 to give an opinion. My father didn't make that in a year in the mid-60s, so it never went anywhere. And we wrote to the National Book Fund and the Pulitzer Prize and all of that. And it's basically known. If you look on Wikipedia, that they'll use the word controversy. What's the controversy that the family feels? And at this point, it's really just basically me. But and it was made into a movie, John Frankenheimer movie. Alan Bates played my grandfather. Dirk Bogard. Bogard was in it. But it was a universally trashed movie, a panned movie. I think they used the word they used. It certainly didn't go anywhere near what the book accomplished. As far as an Academy nominations or anything. And I don't know how much more I could say about that. Again, if people are interested in getting this blue book, there are 36 examples of what Malamud did, stealing from my grandfather, and I think it would open your eyes if you realize what it is. Especially people my age or not my age that remembered reading The Fixer 60 years ago. They would change their whole minds about it because they read it now and they're like, wow, look what he did. Excuse the expression, look what the bastard did. But that's what he did. I mean, he just pretty much whole passages. Okay, so there's
Thank you so much.
okay, somebody said.
Oh, it's okay. I can read the questions for you. The next question is, what happened to Vera, and was she ever actually accused of the murder?
She was murdered by the Bolsheviks. When the Bolsheviks came in, I think I had said that before. Her and the whole gang were murdered, as well as I said before, the judge and the prosecutors and everyone involved basically in the trial that was on the prosecution side. I think Kraniantis probably died a natural death. Sikorsky probably died a natural death because again he had the son with the helicopter business. But again, the Boldarev, the judge, and Vera and the others, they were all murdered, which they should have been. Vera threw acid in one of her lover's faces, and the guy forgave her. So she was a bad person. So most people are just saying thank you, and I really appreciate the comments, and especially when you say things like blessing. Again, I'm not getting feedback from people, so I hope they like it. I don't know. That's the best I can do, and I'll be honest with you, it's one of my better ones because there were other times. I know I had to look at the words once in a while, and I know sometimes I talk fast, but I was a story to tell, and like I told you last night, the story flows, so it's not like you can just jump around from story to story. It has a middle and a beginning and an end. So okay, so I guess that's the end of. And you're ready to say goodbye. Okay, I got it.
Thank you.
The hook is.
I wanted to thank you so much. We do actually have a couple more questions. So one question that we have is, at what point, when you mentioned when you were a child and people would meet you and your father, and that's when you realized that your grandfather was a historically significant person. What was that like throughout your life, and how has that shaped your life?
Oh well, yeah. Again, at the bungalow colonies, I was 10. As far as shaping a life, because people didn't know the story, I would try to tell people, my friends, and everybody heard of Dreyfus, but Dreyfus Dreyfus was still, my grandfather's trial was a lot more important, and I know it's because I'm saying it, but that was still like a military trial. All the Jews of the world weren't put on trial like my grandfather was. It's just that Dreyfus had Zola, who was, and of course it was in France, which was a much more enlightened country. So he was able to, there was a lot more ink. And of course, he was in prison for many years. And again, Emil Zola, and they made a movie about it. And shortly before my grandfather died, they contacted one of the greatest Yiddish actors who made a lot of English movies too, Paul Muni, one of the greatest actors of all time, about making a movie. This is in the early 30s. My grandfather died in 34, about making a movie, and he said the time wasn't right. So we're talking 32, 33. We know what was happening in Europe, in the world in 32, 33. And Paul Muni wrote back to us that the time wasn't right. In fact, at the time of the trial, in New York, there were three Yiddish theaters at the time of the trial, and all three Yiddish theaters, this is well documented, had plays about my grandfather while the trial was going on. There was, again, three Yiddish theaters in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and all three featured stories and plays about my grandfather's ordeal. So at the time, so as I said, even though it's not well known now, it was very, very well known then. Yes.
Thank you.
So Sherry's asking what age when I learned. Well, I said, again, well, I think that's what you basically just asked. I was like 10 years old at the bungalow colonies when these people would come up and bow to my father. I was 10 years old. Who were these grown people in their 60s and 70s and even 80s and like bow to my father? I mean, who's my father? What is this all about? And everything. And then, my mother said, I think it's time you sit down and try to explain to him. I mean, how do you explain to a 10-year-old that another 10-year-old was brutally murdered? I mean, does a 10-year-old really want to hear about 47 blood stabbings all over the body? I don't think so. So in generic terms, my father probably explained it to me one way or the other, but I don't remember the specifics. I don't remember. The Fixer came out in 67. At the same time, Maurice Samuels wrote a book. The 11 book came out only 10 years ago. Was it worth? Wait, are you saying? Ken, are you saying is the 11 book? As I said, that's the definitive work on it. I wasn't allowed to read The Fixer, and there's no reason for. I saw the movie once, and I was like, oh gosh, it was a non. Yeah, well, Maurice Samuels was a Romanian who had his father's notes. Who had his father's notes from the trial, and he wrote a book called Blood Accusation, the story of Mendel Beilis. We met Maurice Samuels. He was born like 25 years before my father, and we went to his funeral. And, for the longest time, that was the definitive book until Ed Levin's book, which came out 10 years ago. But the Maurice Samuels Blood Accusation came out the same year, the same month as The Fixer. So that would be 1967. And again, we need to remember, Maurice Samuels didn't write it from firsthand sources. He wrote it from the letters that his father had. Ed Levin went and read the actual Russian newspapers in Russia, in Kiev, pulled out the actual documents, and that's what's considered primary sources. He wrote that book on primary sources. The Maurice Samuels book was not primary sources. Again, it was just letters. But at the time, again, until Ed Levin's book, it was the definitive work on the case, and told the case as good as it can, along with my grandfather's memoir. I guess maybe I'll try one more time. I don't know why it doesn't.
Thank you. It's because you have a blurred background. It just makes it a little hard to focus. But
so if I take out the blurred background, or
yeah, well, what you can do as well, if you would like to just give us the title of the book, and then I can even type it into the Zoom chat so everyone can read. Yes, but this works now.
Wait, this has to be closed.
Yeah, that works. No, it works. We can see it now when you do that.
Well, I guess it's backwards, but
no, we can see it.
Yeah, that's now you see the rest of my house, but yeah, that's the book that I would prefer. And as I said, it's we edited, and again, it's the complete Yiddish book, and it's the we have 36 examples of what Malama did, and also there's a couple of pages in there about what it means to be the grandson, which of course you just heard. So, but again, as I said, my royalties last year on the book was $43. So this isn't a book endeavor for me. My dream is again to get a movie made, but I'll probably go to my grave before that happens.
Well, I want to thank you so much for sharing your story and your family story with our community. And to those of you who are new to Holocaust Museum LA, We have regular programs, and the museum is actually closed through November 11th for construction. And so in the meantime, we have a lot of virtual programs. You can follow our website to learn more. But again, I just wanted to thank you so much for sharing your family's really important story. And I thought I would close with reading a little bit, just a sentence or two from the memoir that your grandfather wrote, that was translated into English. And this is for the audience, as Mendel Beilis is reflecting on what his imprisonment felt like for him. He said, "One thing I always had before me, the shameful charge of ritual murder must be wiped off the good name of the Jewish nation. It was my fate. It had to be done through me, and in order to be affected, I was to remain alive. I had to exercise every ounce of power. I had to suffer all without murmuring, but the enemies of my people were not to triumph." Learning about your grandfather's story is really important because as we mentioned earlier, this has been a recurring moment in Jewish history, these ritual murder charges, but this is an opportunity for us to learn about it from you, from your family's perspective. And so we're so appreciative for everything that you do by sharing this story. And of course, um, everyone who is here today just learned about your grandfather's story, and we want to make sure to honor his name and his memory and legacy. Thank you so
Right.
much.
It might mean more to me than it may mean to you. It really
Well,
does mean a lot.